This is Town Square Sunday on demand. And now, 1420 WBSM's Jim Phillips.
Good morning and welcome to Town Square Sunday. This is a program that highlights individuals and organizations that are making an impact on the quality of life here on the South Coast. I'm Jim Phillips. Today we're talking about a couple of hot spots around the world. It's not too hard to guess what those are. Glyn Williams is an Islamic history professor at UMass Dartmouth. The resume does not end there. He has lived in the Middle East. He's a former CIA employee. Were you an operative, Professor Williams? Were you an operative?
I was tasked with doing field work in Regional Command East in Afghanistan, tracking Al-Qaeda and Taliban suicide bombers.
Now, he's also written extensively about Russia and its invasion of Ukraine and much more. Professor Williams joins us this morning. And thank you for giving us some time, sir.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure, Jim.
It seems that Ukraine is at a crossroad battling the Russian military right now. U.S. aid is slowed because of a dispute in Congress, and the Russian forces seem to have gained the upper hand. My question is, how do we let a democratic nation, small d, in Europe go down the drain? Because that is how it appears, at least right now.
It's shocking, and it's not what one would expect. You know, I grew up in the Reagan era when Republicans were known for staunchly standing up to Russia. You know, I'm sure we all remember the great Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan telling the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, you know, the wall of communism in Germany there. And to have the Republican Party, of all parties, switch from being the strong defender of democracy, you know, opponents of America as the arsenal of democracy, to switch from that long history, that history of standing up to Russia and Moscow and China and communism, to suddenly having this party with a super minority being guided by Trump and being told to sabotage aid that's desperately needed by the Ukrainian troops on the front lines, trying to save their democracy, save their children from being ruled by this tyrant, Putin. To have the Republicans pull the plug on artillery, which these defenders in Ukraine needed to defend their families and their freedom, is unconscionable, and it is surreal, and it is directly attributable to one man, Donald Trump, and his love for Putin, we call, quote unquote, a genius for invading Ukraine.
Well, give us a little history, Professor. Why is Ukraine so important to Putin and Russia?
Well, it's interesting. You know, Putin has a warped, revisionist view of history where he reinterprets Ukrainians' entire history as being somehow a slave or a province of Russia. And he believes Russia, great Russia, mother Russia, needs to annihilate Ukraine, destroy its democracy, and bring it into Russia. He sees this budding freedom in Ukraine, the free media, the love of democracy, the desire to join the European Union. He sees all of this as a threat on his own doorstep, and it might spread into Russia and inspire Russians who've been crushed by his totalitarian regime for over 20 years. It might inspire his own people to stand up and fight for democracy.
Are the NATO countries that surround the Ukraine still committed to this fight? Are they helping in some way? Because the impression is it's all us.
And that impression is being fed to us by the Republicans. And it is a false impression. Even though we, America, just had a aid package of $60-odd billion that would have gone to Ukraine and saved this town of Avdiivka, which was just conquered by the Russians 4 days ago, because the defenders, Ukrainians, ran out of artillery. They want people to believe that only we, the Americans, are sponsoring this war. But the truth is, even though we just pulled the plug on this aid package because Trump told these Republicans, not all Republicans, small super minority, you know, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, or Matt Gaetz from Florida, these really out in the right wing Republicans. He told them not to vote for the aid package, but the Europeans came through. They just voted last week for a $54 billion aid package to Ukraine. They're sending them state-of-the-art Leopard German tanks. Netherlands just gave all of its artillery to Ukraine. Why are the Europeans doing so much? Because they know that every foot of territory Putin conquers brings Russia closer and closer to their borders. So the Poles are very alarmed by this movement towards them having a long history of being conquered by Russia. So it is propaganda from Trump and many Republicans that Europe is doing nothing and we are doing all the heavy lifting. On the contrary, they've come through just in the last week with a massive $54 billion aid package at a time when we decided to give the democratic, pro-American Ukrainians nothing.
Let me play devil's advocate for just a moment. We have spent billions of dollars sending military aid to Ukraine. Is it fair to ask, when is enough enough?
It is. And the question is, it's enough when you think democracy is worth defending. We sent billions and billions of dollars to aid Europe during World War II from another Putin named Adolf Hitler. And we didn't just send money to save Europe from being turned into the Third Reich of these Nazis. We sent our young men to fight and die in the hundreds of thousands during that war because we knew that if we let Europe fall to Nazis and we let Hitler march across this continent, sooner or later it will rebound on us. We're in exactly that same position now, only we're not having to send our young men to fight and die in the battlefields of Europe. We're just sending our money and our technology, and we're using our weaponry to crush this Russian attempt to build the Soviet Union, which, if it does happen, ultimately might lead to American troops being sent to fight in Europe just as they were in World War II. By just sending our money, we support the Ukrainians, and everything we give them, whether it be Javelin anti-tank missiles or Stinger anti-aircraft missiles or our unbeatable Abrams tanks, these Ukrainians use with tremendous effect. They're fighting against 10-to-1 odds, and they're prevailing. But they're about to collapse because Congress, which is being influenced and controlled by Trump, has told the democratic Ukrainians, we don't support you. We're supporting this brutal mass murderer who just killed Alexander Navalny, and we're to support people who hate democracy. That is what the message we're sending to Putin and to Zelensky with this denial of this aid package.
It's extremely frustrating. We've mentioned it a couple of times because, as you say, aid to Ukraine was ready to go as part of a bill that would also address problems at the southern border. That bill contained everything the Republican lawmakers had asked for when it came to correcting problems at the border. Everyone thought it was a done deal till Donald Trump said, don't vote on that bill or don't vote for the bill. I don't get it, and a lot of people don't get it because I thought we're all on the same team here. But how long can Ukraine forces carry on in this fight? How long can they last? I mean, I've seen estimates that this thing could be over by the spring unless their armies are reinforced with more equipment.
Well, that jives with what I've seen. They are fighting a much larger army with more tanks, more troops. The Russians are throwing in what they call meat waves, waves of World War I style troops storming against Ukrainian lines. The Russians don't care how many troops they lose in battle. According to the CIA, the Russians have had killed or wounded over 300,000 since this war began. Compared to our 7,500 in 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So they're up against a horde, a raping, town murdering of innocent civilians, democracy-destroying horde. They're fighting back. They're rationing their shells. One shell for every 30 shells the Russians fire because they don't have the artillery because Trump decided not to give them weapons to survive. And his party members, who, as you stated correctly, had this deal worked out. The Senate, Republicans and Democrats, came to an agreement on strengthening the border like never before. Everything the Republicans wanted, they got. Biden gave them everything. And the deal was, in return, they will save Ukraine. Everybody was happy. They're all ready to sign it. And then Trump heard about it and intervened and said, nope, I don't want a border deal when I'm not president. I want everything to be open and collapsing and no control of the border until I become president, so I can solve this. And that's how the whole Ukraine deal fell apart. And that's how this strategic town of Avdiivka, which Ukrainians bravely and heroically defended for 10 years, just collapsed and fell and was conquered by Russian hordes 4 days ago, thanks to Trump's intervention.
You're listening to Town Square Sunday. I'm Jim Phillips. My guest, is Brian Glyn Williams, professor of Islamic history at UMass Dartmouth. Another hotspot you are very familiar with, Professor, is Gaza and the ongoing fight between Israel and Hamas. How do you see that ending?
Well, we're going to have sooner or later a peace treaty. We're going to have a ceasefire first, though. America is desperately pushing Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, to have a ceasefire, to try giving some of these Israeli hostages back to their families, to try giving the Palestinians in Gaza, who've lost over 29,000 of their people since this war began, to give them access to food, water, hospitals. The longer this war lasts, the worse it is for Biden, because it's turning many Democrats against him. And the longer it lasts, the better it is for Netanyahu. Because as soon as the war ends, his coalition party, a war coalition party, two separate parties, his government, his war party, unity party will fall apart, and they'll have an election, and he'll be thrown out of office because Israelis correctly blame him for the security lapse. I think it won't end, though, until Netanyahu, who has no incentive to end this, has conquered this last bit of Gaza down the south there, where 1.5 of Gaza's 2.3 million people are now clustered and hiding. It won't end until he conquers that last part in the south called Rafah. And that's going to be a bloody massacre. We'll see the death rates go up because most of the Gazans have all fled south in desperation, seeking sanctuary in this one last town called Rafah. And they have nowhere to go now. They're trapped. And the Israelis are going to hit Rafah brutally with air, sea, and land attacks. And the death toll will go up. And we may see some of the hostages freed. And we may see some more of the Hamas members killed. But thus far, according to the UN, 2/3 of the people who've been killed in Israel's Swords of Steel or Swords of Iron campaign, 2/3 of the Palestinians who've been killed by the Israelis since this war began are women and children. So a lot of women and children will die, I believe, in the near future in Rafah, Gaza.
So the picture really becomes more uneasy every day. Thousands of Palestinians already dead. Many leaders around the world are calling this genocide. Is that what's happening here?
Well, the United Nations, the 1948 conventions, has a definition for genocide. It is an attempt to erase an all or parts of a people. It can be to erase their language, their culture, their collective identity, or them physically, to erase them physically. And increasingly, when you see this effort to eradicate tens of thousands, they lost 10 times as many people as we lost on 9/11 in an area smaller than Washington, D.C., increasingly, when you reach 30,000 dead, and the number is going to go up and up, it does sort of meet the threshold for what the UN calls genocide. This is a genocidal attempt to erase Gazan identity, not Palestinian in general, because the West Bank isn't being confronted with this, but the unique Gazan identity is certainly under a genocidal assault right now before our very eyes.
Look, we know the story. October 6, 7, Hamas attackers killed more than 1,200 Israelis in a brutal attack, unannounced, and whether there was a security lapse or not, there was apparently. It was a terrible, terrible day. But Netanyahu was content to go further, to avenge, yes, those 1,200 people, but to do away with Hamas, and you think all of thousands. What do we need to do to secure a ceasefire? What does Biden need to do? Because he's the key here. He's the key.
But the question is, does he have the clout to stop Netanyahu from this bloody rampage? You know, he has bloodlust. And as you mentioned, that is in many ways understandable. You know, on October 7th, Hamas went into those kibbutzim, those collective villages, and that concert, and they raped so many Israeli women, cut them with knives and swords to pieces after raping them, mutilated their bodies, set people on fire, burned families. You know, this seared the conscience of the Israelis and explains some of this disproportionate mass murder, which we're seeing happening for the first time in Gaza. And the bloodlust is hard to stop. The calls for revenge, the calls for the utter, complete annihilation of these monsters from Hamas who carried out this rapist murderer rampage. It's hard for us Americans to tell them to pull back. But that's what we need to do because this is putting us in a bad position. You know, 3 times now the United Nations has met to try calling for a ceasefire to save civilian lives. And on all 3 occasions, the Biden administration, America, has used its seat on the Security Council to veto those calls for a ceasefire, which would save civilian lives. We become complicit. We are in some ways the collateral damage of Netanyahu's racism, his settlements of Israeli settlers in the Palestinian West Bank, hundreds of thousands having forced into Palestinian lands against their will. Netanyahu drove this rage with his Zionist messianic vision for settling all the West Bank, which is Palestinian, with Hebrews and Jews and Israelis. And we, Americans, who didn't support this campaign, in fact, Biden has come against this racism, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by Netanyahu, we pay the price for it, as we've seen with all these attacks, 170 attacks on our bases in Syria and Iraq. Since this campaign by Israel began, we're being attacked because of our support, our knee-jerk, reflexive support for Israel.
You don't paint a very pretty picture with the Gaza situation, Professor. I don't know how it's going to end. There's got to be a ceasefire. People have to keep working at it. We have to stop here. My guest has been Brian Glyn Williams, Professor of Islamic History at UMass Dartmouth. Thank you, sir, for giving us some time today and your insight.
Pleasure's all mine, Jim. Be well.
Take care. Stay with us. Town Square Sunday will return in just a moment.